Welcome back to Timeline of World History. Last time we focused solely on the year 5000 BC. Today we begin our episode 100 years later in Germany to look at something that would become a regular occurrence, particularly during the 4th millennium BC. The Goseck Circle was a Neolithic structure located near the town of Goseck in Saxony-Anhalt, Germany. It is considered to be the oldest and best known of the circular enclosures associated with the Central European Neolithic, and also may be one of the oldest solar observatories in the world. It was first discovered by an aerial survey in 1991 that showed circular ridges under a wheat field. Due to drought conditions, the crop marks were easy to see from the air. In 2002, François Berthern and Peter Biel of University of Halle-Wittenberg began a major excavation of the site. When they combined the evidence with GPS observations, they noticed that two sudden openings marked the sunrise at summer solstice and the sunset at winter solstice. Wolfhard Schlosser of Ruhr University Bochum believed that this enabled early Europeans to determine with accuracy the course of the sun as it moved across the heavens. He was convinced that the enclosure was constructed for observation of the movements of the sun, moon and stars, as well as to keep track of time. This was important for when sowing and harvesting of crops could occur in Neolithic times. In 2004, a student group from University of California, Berkeley, joined the dig to provide a more international scope to the site. Radiocarbon dating places the construction of the site to approximately 4900 BC. Compared to approximately 200 similar prehistoric mound sites located throughout Europe, the Goseck site has striking deviations. For a start, instead of the usual 3 gates, it had 4 gates that led into the circular compound. The compound consisted of an unusual formation of concentric rings of wooden palisades. These wooden palisades have been reconstructed by archaeologists and state officials by using hand tools to make it look more authentic. Rings and gates into the inner circle became narrower as one progressed to the center that indicated only a few people could enter the innermost ring. Schlosser explained that Goseck wasn't just used as a calendar construction, but was also used as a sacred building. Archaeologists have found remains of what may have been ritual fires, animal and human bones, and a headless skeleton near the southeastern gate, which could be interpreted either as human sacrifice or burial ritual. Dating of pottery shards suggested that the enclosure corresponded to a transitional phase between the linear pottery and stroke-ornamented Ware cultures. The stroke-ornamented Ware culture was the successor to the linear pottery culture in Central Europe from approximately 4700 to 4400 BC. Centered on Silesia in Poland, Eastern Germany and Northern Czech Republic, it overlapped with the Lengyel to the south and Rössen to the west. The pottery which was found at Goseck abandoned incision of the musical note pottery developed in the linear pottery stage in favor of bands of small punctures in zigzag patterns with a vertical band dividing each angle. The result was a band of continuing A-frames. This style of pottery spread down the Vistula and Elbe rivers as a result of the transmission of cultural objects. Like the Lengyel culture, people lived in trapezoidal houses, with one end being made shorter than the other to achieve that shape. The reason for this is obscure, but we noted with the Lengyel that climate change may have played a role in this decision. As for dealing with the deceased, the stroke-ornamented culture tended to prefer cremation to burial. No one knows why the Goseck Circle was abandoned, as no evidence of fire or destruction has been found. What is known is that later settlers built a defensive moat that followed the ditches of the old enclosure. The reconstructed enclosure was opened to the public on the 21st of December in 2005, which of course was the date of the winter solstice. This would not be the last time we will uncover something connected with summer and winter solstices. We have only just begun. The Cucuteni-Trypillian culture was a Neolithic to Copper Age culture that was located in Eastern Europe between 4800 and 3000 BC. It flourished in Moldova, northeastern Romania, and parts of western, central, and southern Ukraine. It extended northeast from the Danube through the Iron Gates to the Black Sea and the Dnieper River. As of 2003, 3,000 cultural sites ranging from small villages to large settlements with hundreds of dwellings have been identified. In 1884, Theodor Burada investigated a quarry at the village of Cucuteni in Isaki County, Romania, where gravel was being mined to maintain the road from Targu Frumos to Iasi. What he found were fragments of pottery and terracotta figurines. Following an excavation in spring 1885, he and his fellow archaeologists published their findings in 1885 and 1889, which were presented at two international conferences in Paris in 1889. Following this, the first Ukrainian site was discovered by Czech amateur archaeologist Vincent Skvoya at the village of Trypillia in Kiev Oblast, Ukraine, in either 1893, 1896 or 1897. He presented his findings at the 11th Congress of Archaeologists in 1897. This was considered the official date of the Trypillian culture in Ukraine. Today, both finds from Romania and Ukraine are merged together to form one continuous culture known as Cucuteni-Trypillian. The roots of the culture can be found with the Starchevo and Vincha cultures of the 6th to 5th millennium BC. During the early period, 4800 to 4000 BC, it was influenced by the linear pottery culture from the north and Boian culture to the south. Over the course of the 5th millennium BC, the culture expanded from the Prut-Siret River region along the eastern foothills of the Carpathian Mountains into the plains of the Dnieper and southern Bug rivers of central Ukraine. Over the course of the next 1,800 years, the culture shared common features with other Neolithic societies, including an almost non-existent social stratification, lack of a political elite, and a rudimentary economy of pastoralists and subsistence farmers. As a society of subsistence farmers, the main occupation for most people would have been cultivating the soil using an ard or scratch plow, harvesting crops and tending livestock. The vast majority of their diet consisted of cereal grains. Wheat, oats, rye, proso millet, barley and hemp were cultivated. Some of these cereal grains were ground and baked to produce unleavened bread in clay ovens or on heated stones. Peas, beans, apricots, cherry plums and wine grapes were also grown, although there is no evidence that wine was produced. Domesticated livestock consisted primarily of cattle, but did include a small number of pigs, sheep and goats. Surviving artistic depictions of animals shows evidence that the ox was employed as a draft animal. Remains and artistic depictions of horses have been discovered. Whether these were wild or domesticated remains to be seen. One hypothesis is that horse domestication occurred on the steppes adjacent to the culture between 4000 and 3500 BC, so it is possible that the culture was familiar with the domestic horse. Evidence for this remains inconclusive. Hunting supplemented their agricultural diet. Traps, bow and arrows, spears and clubs were used to hunt red deer, roe deer, aurochs, wild boar, fox, and brown bear. Brown bear is actually a favorite of mine. Delicious food. At Poiana Slateni in Romania, the earliest known salt works in the world has been discovered. It was first used by the Starchevo culture in approximately 6000 BC. Evidence indicates that the Cucuteni-Trypillian extracted salt from spring water through the process known as briquettage. Brackish water was boiled in large pottery vessels to produce a dense brine. Brine was heated in a ceramic briquette vessel until all moisture was evaporated. The remaining crystallized salt adhered to the inside walls of the vessel. The vessel was broken open and the salt was scraped from the shards. Provision of salt was a major logistical problem for the largest settlements. Relying on cereal foods for their diet, Neolithic cultures had to incorporate supplementary sources of salt into their diet. Trouble is, it had to be moved in bulk from distant sources on the western Black Sea, coast and Carpathian Mountains by river, and some large settlements required between 36,000 and 100,000 kilograms of salt per year. And you thought your diet and my diet, our diet, was bad today with constant reminders that sugar and salt are bad for you. But salt, to a certain extent, is really good. Most early settlements consisted of pit houses, accompanied by increasing incidences of above-ground clay houses. By the Middle Period, 4000 to 3500 BC, dwellings were built with vertical poles in the form of circles or ovals. Log floors covered in clay were incorporated into the building. Wattle and daub walls were woven from pliable branches and covered in clay, and a clay oven was situated in the center of the dwelling. The majority of settlements consisted of high-density small settlements spaced 3 to 4 kilometers apart, concentrated in the Siret, Prut and Dniester river valleys. In the Middle Period, people built the largest settlements in Neolithic Europe, some with as many as 3,000 structures, and populations between 20,000 and 46,000 inhabitants. This is larger than the city-states of Sumer approximately 500 years later. One notable feature of this culture was the periodical act of destruction and recreation of settlements every 60 to 80 years. The purpose of this is a subject of debate. Some scholars have theorized that people believed that every house was an organic, living entity, sharing the same circle of life, death, and rebirth as human beings. At Podori in Romania, the site revealed 13 habitation levels constructed on top of each other over many, many years. Pottery was produced by placing long coils of clay in circles to form the base and walls of the vessel. Once the shape and height was built up, the sides were smoothed to create a seamless surface. Vessels were elaborately decorated with swirling patterns and intricate designs. Decorative incisions were sometimes added before firing and were sometimes filled with colored dye to produce a dimensional effect. At first, colors used to decorate pottery were limited to rusty red and white. Later on, additional colors were added with experimentation of advanced ceramic techniques. Pigments were based on iron oxide for red hues, calcium carbonate, iron magnetite, and manganese jacobsite ores for black, and calcium silicate for white. Between 3500 and 3000 BC, kilns were constructed with separate combustion and filling chambers that were separated by a grate. Temperatures were maintained at 900 degrees centigrade to achieve a uniform and complete firing of vessels. It was only when copper became available that advances in ceramic technology began to wane. Some communities contained a special building located in the center of the settlement. Artifacts were intentionally buried in the ground that has provided insights into some of the beliefs, rituals, and structure of members of the society. Many of these artifacts were clay figurines or statues that were believed to have powers that could help protect people who looked after them. Different figurines were used for different purposes and were not all representative of a goddess. Our old friend Maria Gimbutas based her Kurgan hypothesis, an old European culture theory, on these clay figurines, as she suggested that Neolithic societies were matriarchal, non-warlike, and worshipped a mother goddess before being wiped out by Indo-European tribes from the steppes in approximately 2500 BC. This theory is discredited, as evidence suggests that the Cucuteni-Trypillian was a much more complex society than she had accounted for. There is a debate among scholars as to how the culture came to an end. Disregarding the invasion theory, it is believed that climate change played a part in the downfall of the culture. In approximately 3200 BC, the climate became colder and drier than it had ever been since the end of the last ice age, which resulted in the worst drought in the history of Europe since the beginning of agriculture. As the culture had relied so heavily on farming, it would have collapsed in a similar way to those who endured the disastrous dust bowl conditions of the 1930s in Midwest USA. One problem with this theory is that during the warm Atlantic period, Denmark was occupied by Mesolithic cultures rather than Neolithic. The first period of climate transformation ended 500 years before the end of the Cucuteni-Trypillian, and the second approximately 1400 years later. Known as the Dimini culture after the archaeological remains found at Dimini-Volos, Greece, the late Neolithic Greek period was characterized by settlement expansion and intensification of the farming economy. Densely built settlements contained large rectangular and megaroid buildings made from stone. They were surrounded by ditches 4 to 6 meter wide, 1.5 to 3.5 meter deep, or stone enclosures 1.5 to 1.7 meters in high. These were used to either defend against wild animals or to demarcate limits of the settlements in order to protect their goods. In addition to the mixed farming and stock rearing economy, specialized pottery production, manufacture of jewelry from seashells, and leaf-shaped arrowheads produced from Melian obsidian in the southern Aegean were carried out. Distribution of arrowheads, jewelry and ring idol pendants to the Balkans and Central Europe indicated the development of an extensive exchange network and intensification in navigation. This enabled Dimini to obtain silver and copper for jewelry making. These products were owned by a minority as objects of social prestige. The deceased were buried in simple pits in the contracted or flexed position. Burials of children in jars were carried out, whilst cremation and collection of bones continued. Pottery was continued from the previous Neolithic phases of Greece. Black pottery on a whitish background and incised pottery of classical Dimini was the culmination in the art of Neolithic pottery. The spiral and checkerboard pattern predominated, whilst incised pottery used decorative motif from weaving and basketry. The human figure was rendered schematic, as was manifested from the plank-shaped and cruciform figures. It's time to return to southern Mesopotamia and catch up with the Ubaid people who we talked about a few episodes ago. Previously we mentioned that people arrived in southern Mesopotamia possibly from the Samar culture in approximately 6500 BC. In this area, cereal agriculture was only possible with the aid of canal irrigation from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The earliest known Ubaid site of Tel Ueli attested to a well-developed farming system that relied on oxen as draught animals for cultivation of irrigated salt-tolerant crops such as barley. Later on, in 5400 BC, the first settlement of Eridu emerged that became a regional center for the temple of the Sumerian god Enki. In the meantime, northern Mesopotamia and Syria were still in the late Halaf period. However, things were about to change. Analysis of ceramics and pottery from excavations at Tel Tabila in northeastern Syria indicated that during the late Halaf period, a shift of the settlement system in the northern regions took place. The current subsistence strategy was abandoned in favor of hamlets and villages, with a clear focus on agriculture and animal husbandry for several centuries. Modifications from Halaf to northern Ubaid during the late 6th and early 5th millennium BC can be seen through its architecture and settlement systems. One development was the introduction of the tripartite house with central hall that was seen as an indication that a new form of family organization consisting of extended families had arrived from southern Mesopotamia. In the background of changing living and subsistence strategies, it may be assumed that this change was an attempt to have everything under the roof of one big rectangular building. Architecture and associated artifact distributions suggests economic differentiation between wealthier and poorer households, with the emergence of specific individuals in what looks like positions of leadership. At Tel Abada in central Mesopotamia, a building known as Building A was in the center of the settlement. It was 3 times the size of the smallest houses. Building A showed evidence for unique burial practices, high concentrations of stone artifacts such as mace heads, carved gypsum vessels and stone palettes, as well as administrative tablets such as tokens and clay proto-tablets. The differentiation between Building A and the rest of the settlement reflects that this economic system may have been inherited for several generations. Another development was the introduction of rectangular temples with corners oriented to cardinal points of the compass. These temples contained altars, offering tables, niches, buttresses, and a tripartite long room ground plan. Although they first appeared in Ubaid I, particularly in Eridu, temples would grow larger and more elaborate, appearing at sites such as Varka and Tel Oquer. This reflects the growing influence of a priest caste during the 6th and 5th millennium BC. The noticeable thing about the whole Ubaid period is the stability of the system over a period of approximately 1,500 years. There are only minor changes in settlement, subsistence, and material culture. In contrast with later periods, we have no evidence, we have zero evidence for warfare. Ubaid seals show no depictions of weapons, prisoners, or combat scenes. There are no signs of fortification or violent destruction. Mortuary data from hundreds of Ubaid burials shows no sign of chiefly burials or division in elite to commoner. There is a lack of evidence for exotic, rare, or high-status trade goods. Copper is non-existent in Ubaid sites and only appears in the succeeding Uruk period. Lapis lazuli and gold are not found in Mesopotamia until 1,000 years later. Ubaid sites in southern Mesopotamia tend to be so deeply buried that only limited exposure has been possible. After more than 60 years of excavation at centers, villages, and cemeteries, no exotic luxuries have been found at Ubaid sites. Only at the end of the 5th millennium BC does this pattern show any signs of change when the Uruk period arrives. Although there was no evidence of luxury items, it does not mean that trade didn't happen. On the contrary, evidence for interaction between southern Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf emerged with the identification of 6th to 5th millennium BC pottery at scores of sites in eastern Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Qatar. How did they get there? Recent research showed that advanced boat building and sailing technologies were being developed during the Ubaid period. A maritime exchange existed between Ubaid communities of southern Mesopotamia and the Arabian Neolithic groups of eastern Arabia. Ceramics were an item of trade that was incorporated into the Arabian culture. Evidence can be found at the site of H3 as Sibia, Kuwait. Previously situated at the edge of a sheltered bay, radiocarbon dating indicated occupation began between 5500 and 5000 BC. A complex of stone chambers associated with a mixed material culture combined elements of both Arabian Neolithic and Ubaid. The first find was a 15 cm long model of a boat that was found against the wall of one chamber. It was modeled to give a detailed 3D depiction of a reed boat. Key features included the parallel lines and modeling that represented the shape of reed bundles, as well as a coarse red ware associated with the central gulf. The second find was an image of a masted boat on a ceramic disc. The disc is approximately 7 centimeters in diameter. It was reworked from a sherd of painted Ubaid bowl that bore a pattern of spokes which radiated out towards a scalloped border. 2 spokes remained that resembled a 2-footed mast, whilst the outer edge of the painted border was deliberately abraded to leave a crescent shape resembling a hull. This provided the earliest known evidence for the use of a mast and sail. The third and final find were actual boat remains in the form of pieces of bitumen. This waterproof coating was used to cover the hull of the reed boat and represent the earliest boat remains in the Near East and the oldest known sea-going boat yet identified. The best preserved bitumen pieces measured 5 to 8 centimeters across and 1 to 3 centimeters thick. They were geometric, having straight edges joined to make uneven polygons with 4 or 5 sides. This reflected the underlying structure of the hull. A mesh of strings or ropes were tied or sewn around the bundles or lashings held bundles together to create such a pattern. The bitumen coating was fractured along the lines of the cords. A fragment of a string impression can be seen along the edge of one of the bitumen pieces. The distribution of these bitumen pieces suggested that it was removed from boats and stored for reuse. It may have been recovered from boats for recycling and reapplication, either for repairs or for the construction of a new boat. H3 is one of over 60 Arabian sites that display evidence for contact with Mesopotamia during the 6th and 5th millennium BC. Almost all sites have Ubaid pottery. There are 3 strands of evidence that pottery was sought by the inhabitants of the Gulf and that it was incorporated into their social strata. Although the distribution was mainly coastal, significant quantities of pottery traveled inland into the central Gulf region, some located 60 to 70 kilometers away from the sea. Pottery was distributed throughout the local settlement pattern that reflected the dynamics of the local Neolithic economy and society, strongly implying that the pottery was circulated and used locally. Imitations of Ubaid pottery were made in areas of limited circulation, implying that it was a desirable commodity. It carried connotations of wealth and status, being regarded as an exotic good. Different to southern Mesopotamia, where no exotic goods were found at Ubaid sites. It was not until the end of the Ubaid period in 4000 BC that trade began to break down. Southern influence began to wane in northern Mesopotamia, with local cultures developing large centers with monumental architecture arising in the region. Contact and trade would develop again in the mid-4th millennium BC with the Uruk period, but more on that in a later episode. The Hongshan culture was a Neolithic culture in northeastern China dated to between 4700 and 2900 BC. It is named after the site of Hongshan-hu, Hongshan district, Shifeng, that was discovered by Japanese archaeologist Tori Ryoso in 1908 and excavated by Kazuko Homada and Misuno Seiichi in 1935. The Hongshan culture interacted with the larger Yangshao culture to the southwest. Burial artifacts include some of the earliest known examples of jade working. One striking example, found at Sangsing-Tala in 1971, is a 26 centimeter high blackish green jade dragon. The association of this jade dragon suggests that Inner Mongolia was one of the essential sites to trace the worship of the dragon by Chinese people. In the 1980s, excavators discovered an underground temple complex 1 meter deep in Nühelang in Liaoning province. The temple, known as the Goddess Temple, after the discovery of a clay female head with jade inlaid eyes, was constructed of stone platforms with mural painted walls. Clay figurines 3 times the size of real-life human beings were worshipped as deities for a religion not reflective in any other Chinese culture. Red pottery decorated with black or purple stripes, arranged in parallel lines, triangles, scale-shaped patterns, and set-shaped stripes were suggestive that religious sacrifice might have been performed. No sites devoted to sacrificial rites have been found at the preceding Xinglongwa and Shubugu sites. Outside the complex, cairns were discovered on top of 2 nearby hills with round or square-stepped tombs made of piled limestone containing sculptures of dragons and tortoises. Hence, dragon worship again. Over 60 tombs constructed of stone covered by stone mounds frequently included jade artifacts. Some Chinese archaeologists see the Hongshan culture as an important stage of early Chinese civilization. It is credited with remarkable achievements in architecture, pottery making, jade carving, and pottery sculptures at higher level than preceding Neolithic cultures. The intriguing scenario is that it was the Hongshan that laid the foundation for the development of Chinese civilization, as pottery and stone artifacts have been found 300 kilometers away at the site of Hunshandake in Inner Mongolia, showing that the region housed a large population of Hongshan people. Therefore, the culture was far more wide-ranging than previously thought. People would then have moved south towards the Yellow River once the climate deteriorated, coming into contact with either Yangzhou or later Longshan culture. Could these people be the forerunners of the semi-legendary Xia dynasty? Next time on Timeline, we will look at the first 2 Neolithic cultures of ancient Egypt. We will return to Europe to look at final Neolithic Greece, Varna culture and funnel beetle culture, and look at one of the most famous Neolithic stone alignments in continental Europe. We will look at Karnak in France. If you want to get hold of Shane, who wrote this excellent episode, you can catch him on Twitter at Sarak002 or on his website timelineofworldhistory.wordpress.com. Shane also has a YouTube channel, Sarak002, which is dedicated to PS4 gaming walkthroughs. Check that out. But for now, it's time to say goodbye from Shane of Timeline of World History and myself, the fan of history. Until next time, enjoy your history and goodbye.